After watching Woman of the Hour on Netflix, I found myself unable to shake the memories. You see, I lived through that era. The era when the name Rodney Alcala was not synonymous with evil, but simply a man walking among us. Back then, he was just another face in the crowd, charming, even likable. But beneath that charm was a darkness that few could imagine. The series brought it all back. The terror, the sense of unease that gripped California as women vanished without a trace. Back then, we didn't know the scope of it all. But now, looking back, it's clear. Rodney Alcala wasn't just a killer. He was a master manipulator, a predator who hunted in broad daylight. Let's start at the beginning. Los Angeles, 1968. Rodney Alcala, a young, handsome man, full of potential. He wasn't your typical criminal. Educated at UCLA, enrolled at NYU's film school under the renowned Roman Polanski. But it was all a facade. Behind that carefully crafted image was something truly horrifying. That year, 8-year-old Tali Shapiro became his first known victim. Alcala lured her into his car, promising a ride. She trusted him. But what awaited her was anything but safe. He took her to his apartment, and what happened next was the stuff of nightmares. A concerned bystander saw the abduction and called the police. When they arrived, they found Tali, barely alive, beaten, and strangled. But Alcala? He was gone, slipped away like a ghost. Rodney Alcala knew how to vanish, how to disappear into thin air. It was the first of many times he'd evade justice. Rodney didn't just flee the scene. He fled the state. Under the alias John Berger, he started a new life in New York City. Imagine this. A man who had just brutally assaulted a child was now attending NYU, studying filmmaking, learning to perfect the art of manipulation. He even worked at a summer camp for children. The thought of him being around young girls so soon after his crime in California is chilling. But as we know, he couldn't outrun his past forever. In 1971, after being recognized by someone who had seen his face on the FBI's most wanted list, he was arrested in New Hampshire. For a brief moment, it seemed like justice was finally within reach. But then, the system failed. Tali Shapiro's family, still traumatized by the ordeal, understandably couldn't face a trial. Without their testimony, Alcala was convicted of a lesser charge, assault, and sentenced to just a few years. By 1974, he was free again. Free to kill. This is where Rodney Alcala became something more than just a criminal. He became a monster hiding in plain sight. He returned to Los Angeles, picked up his old habits, only now he was more refined, more dangerous. He didn't just target random women. No, Alcala used his charm, his photography skills to lure them in. He offered them something they couldn't resist, a chance at beauty, at fame. "Let me take your picture," he'd say, and they would trust him. Jill Barcombe was just 19. She had run away from her home in New York, searching for a new life in Los Angeles. But instead, she met Rodney Alcala. Jill was one of his earliest victims. Her body was found in the Hollywood Hills, discarded like a piece of trash. Next was Georgia Wixted, a nurse who had dedicated her life to helping others. She was just 27 when Alcala strangled her in her own apartment. Then came Charlotte Lamb, a 32-year-old legal secretary. These were women with dreams, futures, families who loved them, but Alcala took all of that away. Each murder was more brutal than the last. He didn't just kill these women. He tortured them, toyed with them, photographed their final moments as if they were some sick art project. It's hard to comprehend how someone could be so cruel. But for Alcala, this was the ultimate power, controlling life and death. By the late 1970s, the bodies were piling up, but Rodney Alcala remained a free man, slipping through the cracks. And then, in 1978, he made a move that still shocks me to this day. He appeared on The Dating Game, a national TV show, in front of millions. He smiled, laughed, flirted, and won the heart of the bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw. But Cheryl never went on that date with Alcala. Something about him seemed off. It was that gut instinct, that feeling deep inside that told her to run. It might have saved her life. Can you imagine? A man responsible for the deaths of multiple women, a predator who stalked his victims with the precision of a seasoned killer, was on national television. Acting like he was just a regular guy, he was hiding in plain sight, and no one knew the truth. But even as Rodney Alcala basked in his fame, he was still out there hunting. His next victim was Robin Samsoe, a 12-year-old girl from Huntington Beach. She was full of life, on her way to ballet class when she was abducted by Alcala. Her body was found days later, badly decomposed. The community was devastated, and the search for her killer intensified. Witnesses reported seeing Alcala at the beach the day Robin disappeared, taking pictures of young girls. Finally, it seemed like his reign of terror was coming to an end. He was arrested and charged with Robin's murder. But once again, the legal system would prove frustrating. The trial was a circus. Alcala, ever the manipulator, decided to represent himself in court. He cross-examined the very witnesses who had seen him near Robin on the day of her abduction. He played mind games with the jury, twisting facts, questioning motives, even trying to cast doubt on the evidence. He was a man who had killed without remorse, and yet here he was, acting like he was in complete control. In 1980, Alcala was convicted of Robin Samsoe's murder and sentenced to death. But of course it wasn't over. He appealed the conviction, claiming procedural errors, and in 1984, the California Supreme Court overturned it. It would take another 6 years of legal battles before he was convicted again. And then, once again, his case was overturned. For the families of the victims, it was a never-ending nightmare. Each time they thought justice had been served, Alcala found a way to prolong their suffering. But justice, in its own slow way, eventually caught up to him. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had advanced, and investigators were able to link Alcala to more unsolved murders. Jill Barcombe, Georgia Wickstead, Charlotte Lamb, names that had once been lost in the shadows of the past, were now part of the case against him. He was charged with 5 murders in total, but we know that number is likely much higher. There were those hundreds of photographs found in his possession, pictures of women and girls, some posing, some unaware they were being photographed, and some whose identities remain a mystery to this day. How many more victims were there? How many lives did he ruin that we'll never know about? In 2010, Rodney Alcala was finally tried for the murders of 4 women and Robin Samsoe. He represented himself again, putting on one last grotesque performance in the courtroom. He showed no remorse, no emotion, and in a chilling twist, he played a portion of Phantom of the Opera during his defense, an attempt to paint himself as the tragic figure. But there was nothing tragic about Rodney Alcala. He was a monster, and finally, after decades of pain, he was sentenced to death for the last time. Alcala never faced the execution chamber. He died of natural causes in 2021 after spending more than 40 years on death row. He lived far longer than most of his victims ever did. And even now, even after all these years, his legacy of horror remains. Hundreds of families still wonder if their missing daughters, their sisters, their friends were victims of Rodney Alcala. Some may never know. The story of Rodney Alcala is a story of evil hiding in plain sight. It's a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the man next door, the charming stranger offering to take your picture, the smiling face on a TV screen. We'll never truly know the full extent of his crimes, but what we do know is that Rodney Alcala was one of the most terrifying